All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy through these challenging times. My name is Sandra Miola. I'm the director of the Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. And thanks for joining our plastic session during this year's virtual forum. Really appreciate you joining us. We have about 21 folks that have joined us. I'm sure that number will continue going up, hopefully. Before I kick it off to our presenters, I want to just draw your attention to our chat box question, just something fun as we're kind of going over housekeeping stuff. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat box and answer the chat question, I always love to hear what folks are doing and keeping themselves sane at home. A couple housekeeping items. You'll see that you can change your Zoom name if you click the little button on the top right corner with the 3 dots and hit rename. Some folks, when they join, their name looks a little funny. So just, put your first and last name, and if you feel comfortable, your gender pronouns as well. Also, please keep yourself on mute while the speakers are presenting. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session where we can either take folks off mute or use the chat box. We'll kind of play that by ear. Also, the rest of our program for the remainder of the forum today and tomorrow is found online on sketch.com. I'll put the link in the chat box. And the session is being recorded. It's going to be uploaded on YouTube, hopefully next week. And we'll be sure to send that link around to folks. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dini Checko from ANJAC, our moderator, to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us and this morning, and I'm excited to be here. Sandra, if you can just go forward a minute. All right, so that's my profile, but you can also see me, which is great. So my name is Nandini Checko. My nickname is Dini. As Sandra said, I'm the project director for the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. If you don't know who we are a 51-year-old nonprofit working to educate, empower, and mobilize New Jersey environmental commissions, green teams, and other municipal officials to protect the environment at the local level. And I am really excited to be here today with all of you that are working so hard to solve the problems of plastic pollution and to share this hour with 3 fantastic partners who I'd like to introduce next. So if you can, thanks. All right, so Jonathan Cohen is an associate professor in the School of Marine Science and Policy at the University of Delaware. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from Dickinson College and a PhD in biology from Duke University. His teaching and research focuses on marine and animal physiology and behavior in environmental context. His research projects have covered a diverse range of topics, including animal responses to human-caused stressors, such as plastic pollution and oil spills. And I have a personal connection to UDEL because my son is a student there. So yay, go Blue Hens. So I'm excited Jonathan's joining us. And Logan Welde is a staff attorney, with the Clean Air Council, focusing primarily on energy law and legislation. Before joining the council in August 2012, Logan was a captain in the U.S. Air Force, a financial analyst at Credit Suisse, and a manager of toy operations and Marvel Comics. And Logan received his law degree from Temple University School of Law and a bachelor's from University of Vermont. And Logan lives in one of my favorite cities, Philadelphia. So I love Philly. And then we have Thomas Oppel joined the American Sustainable Business Council as executive vice president after more than 3 decades of management, communications, policy, and politics. One of his many impressive accomplishments is that when Tom was chief of staff to the Secretary of the Navy during the Obama administration, he helped manage the efforts to meet the Secretary's ambitious goals to reduce fossil fuel use in the Navy and Marine Corps ashore by more than 60% in just 5 years. Wow, that is definitely impressive, Tom. So if we have more time, I'd love to hear about that. So thank you. So that's the introduction of our partners. We have a poll up here, which is, what's your biggest plastic waste pain point right now? And Sandra's going to open up the poll. And we'll see. All of these are keeping me up at night. I'm curious to see what is important to you. How does this work, Sandra? You're just going to tell me when it wraps up?
Yep, I'm just going to give folks a couple more seconds. We have about 60% of folks who voted. And sorry, folks, we didn't mean to put the first question in the. We have a dual poll going on right now. How are you keeping yourself grounded? And what's the biggest plastic waste pain? So.
Alex is playing the Jeopardy theme song right now.
double the fun. All right, so we have about 80% folks who have share the results.
All right, so all right, it's pretty close. So it seems that plastic bags just marginally won out at 28%, followed with a tie with takeout containers, and then Amazon and other mail order packaging coming in for second and third tied. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that information. Yeah, so as I said, really all of it is keeping me at night. And so now we're going to enter the gloom and doom part of my presentation, which is the status of where we are with plastics. So the International Solid Waste Association has estimated that consumption of single-use plastics has increased between 250 to 300% during this COVID time period. And in response to COVID-19, there's been a monthly global consumption of 129 billion face masks and 65 billion gloves, which is enough to cover the country of Switzerland in 1 year. So when I heard that, that's pretty shocking. In addition to plastic consumption, COVID-19 is a reminder that human health and environmental health are interlinked, and marginalized communities are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the impacts, and that long-term exposure to air pollution increases the risk of mortality from COVID-19. And this is another example of how human health is really connected to environmental health. And as you folks know very well on this call, the recycling systems around the world are really breaking down because of COVID-19 budget strains. And unfortunately, the plastics industry has been doing some pretty unconscionable things, really putting out some fear-mongering information that reusables are not safe and single-use plastics are the safest choice amid the pandemic. But we know better, and the science is coming out and telling us it's not inherently, single-use plastics are not inherently safer than reusables, as long as we use basic hygiene. Next slide, please. So even with the temporary halt to plastic bans around the world, there is some positive news. And I'm very excited to report that back in August, New York's ban on single-use plastic bags was upheld in New York Supreme Court. Industry lobbyists had used fear-mongering techniques, arguing that the COVID-19 pandemic was a reason to invalidate the law. But the court ruled that reusable bags were a safe option to use during the pandemic, and finding that industry claims were without merit. And so New York is really setting a precedent for the future of plastics legislation. And speaking of legislation, there really is a lot of work going on at all levels. At the federal level, there's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2020, HR 5845. It's extremely strong and it's got bipartisan support. So we're feeling positive about that. And even during the height of the pandemic, local plastics ordinances have been adopted. Here in New Jersey, we have 5 towns that took local action. And I'm going to share a little later about the impact of that on our statewide legislation. And we're going to talk a little bit more a little later about, the worldwide coalitions, such as the Plastic Pollution Coalition and the CDRW's plastic work groups. So there is a coordinated effort to share consistent messaging, and that's making a difference. That's very positive. As per a recent Nielsen study, 3 in 4 millennials 74%, and Generation Z consumers at 72% are willing to pay more for sustainable products and services. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to talk about where we are with the science of plastics.
Okay, thank you, Dini, as well as Sandra, and all of you for attending. So again, speaking from the science perspective, I'll use my time to really talk about what I'm seeing as some big questions in the science of plastic pollution. And so I've got those listed here, and then I'll spend a little bit of time going through each of them. So the first one is, how should scientists standardize protocols for observing and reporting environmental plastic pollution? It's a big question among the science community as we wrestle with how best to put out information about plastic pollution. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about tracking the source of plastic pollution. So are there measurements that scientists can make that allow us to sort of backtrack and say, you've got this plastic in the environment, how can we figure out where it came from? And then also, assuming that we can, try to then understand, why is it that we seem to be missing 99% of the plastic waste that's predicted to be in the ocean in observations of plastic, if we think about ocean plastic. So there's a fundamental mismatch between what we're able to observe and what we predict as being in the ocean, at least. And then last, how do we understand ecological impacts of plastic pollution, either now or in the future? And so I want to just talk briefly about a framework using ecological risk assessment, where we can try to get at that and give some sense of that. Next slide, please. So in terms of standardizing protocols, if you look at this cartoon on the upper right, what it's showing is how you go from a plastic item of sort of a larger macro plastic item, and then what happens to it. So as you sort of follow that arrow down, there's fragmentation and then leaching of material from that plastic. And so in terms of fragmentation, you have a plastic particle that then breaks down into a smaller plastic particle, and then a microplastic, a nanoplastic. Eventually you're into the oligomers and the chemical fragments of that material, so what it's broken down into. One question is, can plastic ever break down? So at some point, presumably you can't see it, which is fine, but does it mean that that material is completely gone? And so there's an active debate about that. An active debate about which of these factors are most important in weathering a plastic, and then an active debate about sort of the adverse effects and vertical transport, and I'll get into that a little bit. But even this arrow going down showing microplastics, nanoplastics, and oligomers, there are questions about how we break those bins down. So a working definition is less than 5 millimeters puts you in the microplastic range, but where exactly to draw the nanoplastic line is sort of actively debated. And then, I mean, it may seem like a semantic point, but it's actually really important for how we sample the material and how we report out how much stuff there is. We then look at sampling. So, okay, it's all well and good to say there's this much material in the environment, but how do you get at that number? Well, you need to count it. And so one way to do that is to drag nets through the water and grab plastic material. You can pump water and filter that water. You can just take a liter of water or however much water you want and look at that. The problem is you get very different volumes of material. And because this material isn't evenly distributed in the environment, it's really gathered in specific spots. It's hard to just take 1 liter of water and say, this is how much material there is. And so that becomes problematic. And now that there's also the use of satellites and drones, which are very promising for macroplastic and large aggregations of material, but don't really work at the really small scale. Then you get into the identification side of things, and we have to either manually count the plastic or use various analytical chemistry approaches, Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy or Raman spectroscopy or pyrolysis, GCMS. People have their different methods. And one of the nice things about the plastic research field is that people are coming at it from all sorts of avenues. People are coming from the more biosciences, they're coming from more analytical chemistry fields, and they're bringing with them their skill sets. The problem that you get with that, I mean, apart from the really positive sides of that diversity of ideas, is this conflict that we're in about what's the appropriate method to use. And so people have their pet methods, and that's really kind of coming into conflict in the field. It's getting to the point, hopefully this year, maybe ideally into next year, where people are realizing the need for the synthesis of standards, and we're coming at recommendations for which techniques are the best. And then ultimately we need to report out how much stuff there is, how much plastic there is. And so whether that's, you know, concentration, mass, particle size, again, all those are debatable. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Ideally, we want to know where the stuff came from. And so let's say you have textile washing, personal care, cosmetic products, tires, packaging, various sources. We want to be able to go to a given site and say, this material most likely came from textile washing. What you're seeing on the right, which is a little blurry, each of the colors represents a different plastic type: polyethylene, polycarbonate, ABS plastic, polypropylene. And so you can see for a given site, you might have a breakdown of the different polymer types. And what we would love to be able to do is then trace back based on that polymer composition where this material likely came from. And this is kind of a holy grail for plastics research, because then we can inform management and remediation. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that if we can do this source tracking, then we can really try to get at, again, another $1 million question. And that is, if we predict about 8 million tons of plastic to be entering the oceans annually, we know that we can only find about 1% of that at the sea surface. So there's other processes going on that are transforming that plastic and putting it into different places, not just at the sea surface. And so some plastic sinks and some floats. And so that's probably likely responsible for that. Shorelines are likely trapping some of this plastic material, which makes it hard to just go out and sample what's in the water or in a river, because you're trapping the material on the shorelines for later release in many cases. This question I brought up about macro versus microplastic, what's the right size scale to be looking at, is tricky, and it's probably playing into this issue. And also biological processes, so organisms ingesting the plastic, transforming it, microbial growth on the plastic, which changes its dynamics. Next slide, please. Assessing ecological impacts of plastic pollution, again, is kind of tricky because it depends on these things that I've just talked about. We know that marine organisms, freshwater organisms as well, interact with plastic pollution in a variety of ways, whether it's macroplastic and it's actually a large piece of material that's a blockage to the digestive system, a microplastic or a nanoplastic, which can interfere with normal food acquisition, or in the case of nanoplastics, cross biological membranes. So in the upper right, you see oysters and crab larvae, as well as fecal material coming from copepods. And those little beads are ingested plastic. The colored green are also fluorescently labeled plastic. So clearly these organisms can ingest the material. At that small scale, it seems like the science suggests that it's mostly dietary disruption, not just death of the organism that happens. So they can't acquire enough good food, and so they end up not doing as well as they would otherwise. I just wanted to make the comment, in a recent study that we did in my lab, we sampled blue crabs in Delaware Bay from a tidal creek, and about half of them contain plastic, mostly in their stomachs. And so not something that's typically ingested when a human eats the crab, but we do see it in the digestive cecum as well, which often is the mustard. So some people do eat that. And then there's the question of mobilization of nanoplastics. So all of that is out there, but I just wanted to share that with you. Could we have the next slide, please? And then lastly, I just want to talk about ecological impacts through ecological risk assessment. So an approach that's getting more traction to try to understand ecological impacts, rather than just, does this organism eat plastic or not, or does it have plastic in it, is the idea of an ecological risk assessment, where you've got the formation of a problem. In this case, does plastic affect some organism? You characterize the exposure and the ecological effects of that exposure, and then you develop a risk assessment. The next slide. And so we've been doing this, again, for blue crabs, one of my favorite organisms. So blue crabs mate and reproduce in estuaries, and then they move offshore, and the larvae develop in the coastal ocean, and then they come back and become part of the population. And so we've developed a way to use this ecological risk assessment approach to understand ultimately what's in the bottom right there, blue crab population effects, because that's the really important bit of understanding ecological impacts. It's not an organism by organism effect. It's rather, do you have an effect on the population and ultimately the community? So that moving that understanding from just dosing an organism to putting it in this framework and trying to understand population effects is what's required. And then the next slide. So So the other thing that we're applying this in various contexts to fish, to copepods, crabs, and what you need to do in this case is say there's this much risk from microplastic exposure, and you get that by the overlap of how much material there is and what the effect there is at a given exposure level. So it requires laboratory experiments and also a lot of modeling, computer modeling, to understand how plastic is distributed. You can just see in the snapshot of Delaware Bay where we've modeled plastic distributions, the plastic is gathered in sort of tendrils all about the bay. It's not necessarily evenly distributed. And so that's sort of the basis of our understanding of this, is to try to place organisms in the context of the plastic they experience and then how that plastic affects them. And so it's a complicated process, and it's one that is actually making pretty good traction. And in a few years, I think the community will understand a lot more than we do, and we're already understanding more than we have. I think that's my last one. Yep. And I think that was 10 minutes.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to have Logan jump in and talk about what's happening in PA.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Logan Welde, and I am, as Dini mentioned, a staff attorney at Clean Air Council. It's an environmental nonprofit based in Philadelphia. We work in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. And she mentioned I am he, him. And Dini had mentioned that I had a varied background, and I did. I was expecting to spend my whole life doing finance, and I just became so disillusioned with the amount of plastic. I was living in New York, and I couldn't believe the amount of trash and plastic. This was in like 2000, early 2000s. And then I traveled around, and I was in Thailand for a few weeks, and it was just completely covered in plastic. And I decided that I really needed to change my career and have an impact and try and make some change. So that's when I decided to go to law school and work on plastic issues. So my presentation is not going to be as cool as Jonathan's. It's about preemption, which is really not a very exciting thing, but I'll try and make it as exciting as possible. And I'll just give you a little bit of background. We have been trying in Philadelphia to pass plastic bag laws since I graduated from law school. It was the first thing I started working on, and the state has been working as diligently to block the city from doing it, and any municipality. So preemption is the tool that the state has been using. Preemption is when a larger entity, state or federal government, blocks a lower entity from passing anything that they don't want to pass. And I don't know if my slides, you can just click. Yeah, you can just click it all through. And so, sorry, I don't think I set it up that way, but so we've got federal law, state law, and local municipal law, and the local is a creature of the state, and the state is in some ways a creature of federal law, although the Constitution has some bifurcations in it. And the preemption will set it can set a floor, so you can't go below certain standards. And in some cases it sets a ceiling, and you can't go above those. And the bad ones from environmental point of view are the ceiling. The good ones from an environmental point of view are the floor. In Pennsylvania, it's been the Republicans and ALEC. I assume a lot of you know what ALEC is. It's the American Legislative Exchange Council. And they are really, I think of them as kind of like the Darth Vader, the empire behind the scenes in the world, I guess. They set laws. I don't know how much influence they have in the rest of the world, but in America, they really influence a lot of what's going on in our state and even local legislation. So next slide. Yeah, you can just click through all of it. So common preemption issues, we've got plastic, rent control, And lately, I'm sure a lot of you heard the debate about Georgia's face masks. Atlanta tried to pass a local law, and Georgia blocked it. Then the governor did kind of an about face and said, "Well, we won't block it completely, but they did block it," and that was setting up to be preemption. And luckily, they backtracked a little bit about it. Next slide. So preemption was often, there is a lot of conflict in between states, and that's where often you'll see the Supreme Court of the United States step in and settle conflicts. But there is conflict, and preemption from a federal level is good to resolve conflicts, like, drinking age and driving age and things like that. It is helpful for the federal government to set standards that the states can adhere to. Since we are United States, we do need some sort of unifying laws. And like I say here, it was traditionally a floor. And that was the traditional use of preemption was, hey, you've got to be as protective as this. And like the Voting Rights Act and things like that, it did help a lot of people in the past, and now it has become sort of a tool of the right and of conservatives to block movement of progressive groups. Next slide. So, like I said, there's the floor, the ceiling, and then the vacuum. And next slide. So floor, we talked a little bit about that. A higher power would, like the federal government has set up the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act sets minimum quality standards, and states can't go below that. They do, as you see in that sub-bullet there, they gave states the authority to do more, which is really, like I said, the best source of preemption is, hey, here's the minimum standard, but you are allowed to exceed that and be more protective. So some states have extremely valuable water. I mean, we all have valuable water, but some states, they want to protect, they have a lot of tourism. So some rivers, they want to have it, the quality be higher than others. And right now, no surprise, Trump is actually trying to take those states' rights away. Okay, next slide. So the ceiling is something that is also used by the federal government, and sometimes it can be good if it's a good law, and often it's not good though. So the Microbead Free Waters Act, and I think, Jonathan, I don't know if in those little, I was thinking of those as microbeads. They might have been microbeads, and I'm sure you've done a lot of work on that. Microbeads are in your face wash and in other things. They feel like, when you rub them on your face, it feels really nice and massaging, but those are actually little pieces of plastic, and those wash off into the water, and they're extremely difficult. Our water system really wasn't meant to capture all of these small pieces of plastic. So there was the Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015, which was great, but it blocked other states from doing things, which I think was an unfortunate miss. Okay, next slide. So the vacuum is when higher power doesn't regulate, but they say, hey, you can't do it. And Pennsylvania's plastic law is exactly like that. It doesn't say, hey, there is a standard, a floor or a ceiling. There's just nothing. You can't do anything on it. And really, it is a favorite of conservatives because they don't need to do any work on it. They can just say, hey, you're not allowed to do any legislation on this issue. Next slide. Okay, so in Philadelphia, and I know I'm running tight on time here. So in Philadelphia, we've been trying for years, and Clean Air Council actually has been trying for, I think, 2 decades almost now, to pass plastic bag legislation. In June, Councilman Squilla introduced the bill, and then a week later, so that was June 20th, a week later, which was also my birthday, the Pennsylvania legislature blocked it in the fiscal code. And they had tried before to do it numerous times, and Governor Wolf vetoed the individual bills. But the legislature actually found this very sneaky way, and I assume it was with Alex's help, to put it in the fiscal code, which the governor did not feel he was able to veto. There is line item veto power, but this governor does not feel that he has that power. So the bill is actually active in Philadelphia. Next slide. But it is currently blocked by Pennsylvania. And so, like I said, also there was a soda tax bill, and the Pennsylvania Republicans snuck in language saying any object designed to be used by consumers for consuming or transporting food or beverages was not allowed to be legislated. That we didn't even know that was in the bill until someone, I hadn't focused on the soda tax issue at the time, which I do now, but someone let us know that, hey, this language actually blocks plastic bags. So they're very sneaky, and I think that's one of the things that I've been learning over the last 10 years is that the legislature goes out of its way to be sneaky and block progressive movements. Okay, next slide. Okay, so it was signed into law. So right now, Pennsylvania blocks it. Next slide. Okay, so that past preemption ended. And then the current, because of COVID, like Dini had mentioned, a lot of municipalities felt that they couldn't rely on reusables. So instead, they came up with this excuse, and in Pennsylvania, that, like I said, the preemption law expired, and then they did a new one, and they also added in there that there was, because of the state of emergency, you couldn't do anything on single-use plastic, auxiliary containers, wrappings, or polystyrene until 6 months after Governor Wolf's order on emergency ends. So that was really troubling. We're in that right now, and we are currently being preempted in Philadelphia, and there are a number of other municipalities that are trying to pass plastic legislation, and they're not allowed to. Right now, there's only 2 municipalities that have Westchester and Narberth that I know. I believe that's true. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But in Pennsylvania, there's only 2 right now that have any legislation. Next slide. So yeah, there's a possible lawsuit. We have Article 3. There's single subject, but also I think more importantly, Pennsylvania has a Pennsylvania constitutional amendment that allows, and you saw in Jonathan's presentation, the environment is just being completely littered with plastic. It's 48% of the crabs that he saw had some sort of plastic in them, and I've read that we're eating a credit card size worth of plastic every week. So the Pennsylvania Constitution has a protection for the environment in it, and it would be interesting to see how much courts will allow that argument. Next slide. And I think that's not mine.
It's mine. That was the end.
So yeah, I'm done.
Thanks, Logan. Appreciate it. So it is very interesting. The politics in every single state in our watershed is very unique and different. Here in New Jersey, because we have over 100, at this point we have like 130 local ordinances, it really made a really big difference, and that's why we have this statewide bill that's getting some traction. My colleague Alex Ambrose, who's on the call today, she's been instrumental in helping to push for this statewide single-use ban on plastic, paper bags, styrofoam, and straws upon request. And we're actually on the eve of a major event happening tomorrow. We're finally getting some traction on this bill, and it's going to be heard in Assembly Appropriations. So please send us some good vibes so we can join New York in celebrating our statewide bill. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of the other stuff, and I'm going to pass it on to Tom right now.
Thanks, Dini. Geez, it's really nice to participate in this political climate that we're in the U.S., where we start with science and then go to the law. Amazingly, we don't do that nearly enough. I'm the Executive Vice President of the American Sustainable Business Council, which is really a network of businesses who are committed to turning around the narrative. As Logan mentioned, Alec, on the legislative end, from the business side, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers tend to be the alleged voice for business. And they are almost always on the wrong side of every issue, whether it's the environment or economics. So what our network is trying to do is present the alternative business voice and change the narrative to recognize that it is a false choice to say that we have to pick between a healthy economy and a healthy environment. That in fact, as a sign that I saw in the youth climate strike in 2019, sort of summed up the problem, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So it is a false choice to say pick one, economy or environment. If we don't have a healthy environment, we will not have a healthy economy. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. This is just some of the campaigns we've been involved in. Let's go to the next slide, Sandra. And some of the ways that ASBC gets involved. We are an advocacy organization. We focus not just on the federal level, but also on state and local level as well. In fact, we have organizations, the New Jersey Sustainable Business Council is affiliated with us, the New York Sustainable Business Council. We have a new Delaware Sustainable Business Council, all of which in this watershed. And we work very closely with them on various issues in terms of the watershed itself and other public policies, including the plastic bag bans. Next slide. So one of the things that ASBC did was we pulled together both companies, businesses, and some other organizations and created a working group. We started sort of focused on the issue of sustainable packaging. It's really become a little broader than that. And the first thing that we decided to do was set up a series of principles that would give us a way to measure our advocacy activity in looking at and evaluating various bills, whether they're at the federal level or state or local level. And so we came up with 4 basic principles. We tried to keep it as simple as possible. And the 4 principles, as you can see in this slide, involve promoting circularity so that materials can be reused. And the problem with plastics is even in the production, you are producing something that is toxic. You are using materials, fossil fuels are a key component of plastic production. That's clearly having an impact on our environment. And then, you know, at the end of the cycle, most of these plastics or many of these plastics are single use and are designed to simply be thrown away. And so they add to a waste pile either in a landfill or they're burned and release other toxins into the atmosphere, or as we've heard this morning, they get dumped in the ocean. And as Dini mentioned, I did spend 8 years as as chief of staff to the Secretary of the Navy, and went a lot of places where I saw a lot of plastic trash, you know, both in the oceans and in some of the Pacific Island nations in Africa. You know, it's heartbreaking. The second principle is really a notion of something that I'm really proud of, in part because while there is always talk about the producers, and of course the producers have a major role in reducing plastic waste, it's really a shared responsibility. And in part, you know, this is a matter for consumers who have to take a role in understanding what is recyclable, what is compostable in the products and the packaging that they demand and the convenience that they demand. but it's also a responsibility of government in order to create the kinds of infrastructure that we're going to need in order to create the kind of circular economy that we hope for, where we are reusing, we are recycling, and we are reducing. All of that requires participation from not just business, but also from government and from consumers. And then principle 3 is accelerating the circular market, is basically the idea that we ought to be taking steps to make sure that we are not promoting additional use of single-use plastics, and it requires a rethinking, a reimagining, if you will. At the beginning, when the pandemic first really became sort of present in people's minds in February and March, as was noted before, the plastics industry, the petroleum industry, did a pretty, from their perspective, great job of scaring people. And there were some states, some localities that actually suspended movement toward banning plastic bags. They were scared out of this, you know, with faux science into believing that somehow reusable bags might be carriers, you know, for the virus. And you know, and these are things that we have to combat. We have to sort of confront it and combat it with science and law. And so good for that it went forward. Some other states have dropped their suspensions of their plastic bag bans, but it requires sort of constant vigilance. And then the fourth principle is transparency and communication. And that's a requirement. And there are organizations that are working on standardizing recycling. So you're not spilling your coffee, looking at the bottom of the cup, trying to figure out, you know, is it recyclable? Is it compostable or not? Making it easier for consumers who want to try to do the right thing to understand, you know, what the expectations are, what the standards are, and making it a lot simpler. And I think there's an argument to be made that these standards haven't been set because, you know, because it benefits the plastics industry and the petroleum industry. If it's confusing, then it's just, you know, let's make it easy. Just throw it away. Throw it in the trash. That's simple. And so that supports their effort to continue doing these sorts of things. So those are the four principles that we have come up with as a working group in trying to sort of evaluate how we go forward. The last piece of this that I'll say is, and I'll just admit straight up, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review, as it says in April. I encourage everybody to go look at it. It was a great piece, and it sort of that we try to make all the time, that in fact, the environmental efforts we need, the efforts we need to save our planet from climate change, from being buried in our own waste and plastics, are in fact not job killers, not economy killers, but they will in fact, those measures, the innovations will be what drives our economy in the 21st century. It will be job creation with energy and the innovations in terms of storage technology, but also some of the aspects of looking for new materials to replace plastics, materials that can be reused, that can be recycled. So, you know, this slide was intended as sort of a quick summary of that article to basically say, look, here's the business case, which is what we try to make, the business case to support the efforts we need to do to mitigate against climate change, to reduce plastics, to reduce waste. So we believe that, as this article lays out the case, that these steps will be about driving innovation and reducing operational costs for a lot of businesses, reducing capital costs, that it will mitigate risk. The risk right now that businesses face, whether it's fires in the West or extreme storms in the Gulf Coast and other places. These are the kinds of risks. It's hard to do business when you're 10 feet underwater. So with rising sea levels, with more extreme storms, with more extreme weather patterns and fires, these are the kinds of things that we have to understand. All of this is interrelated. We're going to see more pandemics if we don't take the steps now to address what's happening to our climate and understand that many of the things that are changing the climate are the things that are creating all these bad actors. And then, of course, lastly, for business, winning new customers and increasing brand loyalty, because particularly a younger audience understands that they are looking for companies who are committed to doing the right thing, committed to preserving the planet for them. So with that, I think I'm right about time, and I'll turn it back over to Dini.
Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate it. So yeah, business has to play a role. Getting rid of plastics or reimagining it is truly a very complicated effort. And to that end, there was just this past month, the U.S. Plastics Pact was introduced, and it's going to bring together businesses and government entities and non-government organizations and researchers to work collectively towards a common vision for a circular economy on plastics. So what's exciting here with this particular pact is the World Wildlife Fund, the Recycling Partnership, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are partnering with heavy hitters such as Walmart and Target to work on 4 impactful targets for 2025. So we're not talking about 2050, we're talking about 2025. And the first target goal is 2021, which is to define a list of packaging define a list of packaging that's to be designated as problematic or unnecessary. And the other thing is, if you guys haven't heard, it's called Beyond the Bag Challenge. And this is an IDEO challenge backed by large retailers, again, as Walmart and Target and CVS, to reinvent the single-use plastic bag. And you can win up to $1 million, and there's still time to enter if anyone has ideas. The deadline is October 2nd. And this is from Open IDEO. So they're looking for a cutting edge solution. So there is movement happening. And I just quick word on recycling that, Tom mentioned as well. Recycling is really not the answer. So we can't replace and phase out bans. So, let's continue to support recycled content, but recycling is definitely not the answer. And can you go forward, please? Advocacy and messaging. Kim asked this question in the chat box. What can we do? What can individuals do? And this is really important, to share fact-based information like what was shared today from our speakers, and make the business case that reusables are the most cost-effective. There's a great program called Rethink Disposable that can help with that. Vote with your wallet. There are a ton of resources. I just gave you a couple organizations on the slides. I really encourage you to look into these organizations. Share the movie, Story of Plastic, Microplastic Madness. Get out the vote and use the CDR network and resources. But the message has to be that from generation to waste, plastic is connected to climate change and human health and environmental justice, and that this is a solvable problem. And this message must be in our advocacy to make the greatest impact. But despite all this hardship, this is also a great time for opportunity to not revert back to business as usual, and really transcend and build a stronger and healthier future for all of us. And I think that's it. So these are our email addresses. If you want to have any follow-up questions for us, we will take some questions right now. I'm going to check the chat box. So Logan, there was a question in here about the Green Amendment. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the constitutional amendment in Pennsylvania protects it's Article 1, Section 27. Let me see. Do you want me to put a link in the chat box? I'm pulling it up
Sure.
right.
That'd be great.
So it says the people have the right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. So I'm going to put that in this chat box. I could probably, and I don't even know, I'm not an expert on it, but I could probably talk for a few hours about this. It never got any traction when it was originally passed in Pennsylvania. And then it was in law and court challenges, if you pick bad cases with bad facts, sometimes you set yourself up to have bad precedent, and that lasts a very long time sometimes. So that was the case with this. There was a developer in Valley Forge that used this to block a building from going up, and the court said, no, we're not gonna give this any credence. So nothing ever happened with it. And then recently, in 2011, I think, or 2012, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, hey, actually, there is something to this Pennsylvania amendment, and we've got to treat this as any other constitutional amendment, and it does have its own teeth. They never gave it any sort of power before. And then there was a subsequent case which even expanded that. A lawyer named Childs argued in front of the PA Supreme Court that the taking gas from public lands without paying the environment was wrong. And I was at a conference when he talked about what he was going to file, and literally half of the room laughed at him. And it was there were a lot of people, and it was the Harrisburg Environmental Law Forum. And they said, what, are trees gonna be, get the money? They made those types of jokes, and he won. And now we have a fairly strong Pennsylvania constitutional amendment, which gives, it holds these things in trust for us as Pennsylvanians. And the government needs to protect that as any other trust. So when the state, in my opinion, when the state legislature passes a law that says, hey, no municipality can do anything with plastic, they're blocking the municipalities, I guess I would say their duty to protect the environment for the people in Philadelphia or the people in Narberth, et cetera. And that is enshrined in our Constitution. And so I think that the legislature has violated the state constitution by passing this type of law. I don't know if that answered everything. There's a lot more to it, and I can give some cases in the chat box if people are interested, or you can contact me and we can talk more about it.
Thanks, Logan. We got another question from Alex here. If you can snap your fingers and make one policy change, what would it be? Tom, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I think a great place to start would be the Break Free from Plastic pollution bill that's introduced by Senator Udall, who is retiring, unfortunately, and Congressman Alan Lowenthal from California. Obviously, got introduced early this spring. The world changed. Not much movement since then. The hope was that the House might act on it. Very little likelihood that a McConnell-led Senate would even take it up. But certainly hoping for a change in administration and in the Senate next year in a more favorable environment. That would be the first place I'd start.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, I certainly don't have the command over the legislative approach to answer it specifically, but I think something that gets at, I think as Logan mentioned in his response, packaging, excessive packaging, and how to deal with over-packaged items. I feel like that's creating a bigger issue than it needs to be. And if you go to other countries, for example, you don't see as much of it. So clearly it's possible to do in a better way.
Oh, no, I agree. Yeah, manufacturer responsibility would definitely be top of my list. And I am also, like you, Tom, a big fan of the federal bill because it'll push back on that. One of the things that our Boston coffee always says is here in the US, let me see, we don't follow the discretionary principle. Is that right, Alex? Am I saying this right? Where in Europe, they'll look at a policy and a product and determine if it's going to be in the best interest. Here in the US, we push stuff out, and then later on, we're like, was that a good idea? Precautionary principle. Thank you, Alex. The precautionary principle. And here in the US, we tend to put stuff out, and then we'll look into it later and be like, oh yeah, maybe that wasn't so bad, or that was bad, or that's okay. We really need to do this better. We really need to assess the situation first before we put it out into the marketplace. Feel free to take yourselves off mute if you want to join in on the conversation. Thanks, Sandra. And let me see, do we have any other questions? There were suggestions in there about using Trex. Trex is there's a link to Trex. They do a fantastic job. Let me see, we have a few more minutes. Do you guys want to add anything else?
I have a question.
Oh, great. Go ahead, please.
Stacy. So a lot of this is the legislative end of things, but I'd like to ask if there's sort of a public education. I see some things on occasion, but I was just wondering if there was sort of like a public education movement in certain organizations to empower consumers, to make them aware of the fact that they have a choice and there's different options that they can choose.
Yeah, there's a push. I mean, there are organizations like Upstream Solutions and Beyond the Plastic Bag that have the tools that can be used to push back on this. In New Jersey, we're the first state to have climate change as part of the K through 12 public education policy. And we are going to be talking about putting plastics as part of that curriculum, so kids understand and make that connection.
I would say the best education. So I had mentioned Pigouvian tax in the chat box there. Pigouvian tax is really just an economic theory on paying for what the actual item costs society. So there is a societal cost to everything, idling your vehicle, getting a plastic bag, etc. The best education in my mind is, instead of walking into a store and getting a, quote unquote free plastic bag, you pay for it. That educates people and explains to them that there is a cost to society for all of these items. So, and I think that would probably be, other than, the federal legislation, if we passed taxes, on these items, not only would it do a great service in educating people about the environmental impacts of them, but it would also reduce the use by, 60 to 80%.
If I could just jump in really quickly, I think one of the other things that we are pushing for, whether it's the National Institutes of Standards or other, the Department of Commerce, not in this administration probably, but standards and studying the external costs, so that we can actually put a price. For example, we're working to put a price on carbon, to appropriately price it so that people understand, when you put carbon into the atmosphere, here are the costs you're imposing on people, whether it's health or other environmental impacts. But actually creating the standards that enable us to measure those external costs. So it's not simply, geez, it's going to cost me $1 million to put scrubbers on my coal smoke, my smokestacks. It's understanding that, on the bottom line, as you do the math, here's the accounting. It's $1 million to put the scrubbers on, but it's a $10 million savings to society in terms of healthcare costs, impact on people's homes and cars, et cetera. So truly understanding that gets us to what I think Logan is very smartly going toward, which is actually understanding truly what the real costs are and actually then paying for those costs.
Imagine, Jonathan's slides on the ocean. What does the ocean cost? What does clean water cost,
Ask any beer drinker.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming up on 11. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And I think that's all we have. Sandra?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Enjoy the rest of the
you.
conference.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.